one of the main goals of physiological testing is going to be to break apart those different levels. What is low intensity for you? What is medium intensity for what is high intensity for you? And then obviously, what can we do with that information, and what should you train, right? Because there's what is, and then what you should do.
You mentioned Evan Picon. I wanted to hear a bit more about his view of the limiters that we've spoken about before, because I think that resonated with me when I heard about it as well, in terms of how to really meaningfully target somebody's physiology in the way that would yield the most performance benefits. So could you walk us through sort of how he came up with that model, or what that model is for people who haven't heard about it yet?
The main idea was that you have those three main systems when it comes to energetics: the respiratory system, the cardiovascular system, and the muscular system. And obviously all of those interact when you do any type of exercise. And the idea is that one of those systems is typically your limiting factor. And so if you can assess which system is limiting you currently, and then train that system specifically, you'll be able to improve and then maybe find a new limiter, right? So it's always kind of attacking that low-hanging fruit. And then once you pick that one, obviously there's another fruit to go and pick after that. And so the body is dynamic and it changes over time. And then what you need to work also evolves over time, which we know is true, because you might do a training for 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 16 weeks on a given quality, and it yields great results. And then just doing it over again just after, it doesn't guarantee that you'll get the same improvement as before. Typically, it's even almost guaranteed that you won't get as good an effect as before, simply because the body accommodates to the stimulus, right? Adaptation is one of the main principles of sports preparation, physical preparation, and just all living bodies adapt to the stimuli that they're confronted to. And anything that's new is going to have a bigger effect than things that you've been doing for weeks or even months. That's why sometimes the best training you can do is just something different, especially if you've been doing the same thing over and over and over again. At the beginning, it works really well. Towards the end, it's a bit more difficult, and you're putting a lot of energy into it. So back to those limiting systems from Evan's model, the idea was that through different types of testing, and one thing that I learned thanks to Evan, amongst others, was using the Moxie monitor to do some physiological testing. This is where everything started for me when it comes to that testing. And with the Moxie, you could assess different things inside the muscle itself. The Moxie is a measurement tool that is non-invasive. So you just essentially put it on the muscles like a patch, and it's going to essentially measure the oxygen transporters, so the hemoglobin and the myoglobin, the kind of cousins. If you look at the molecular structure, it's like hemoglobin is composed of almost 4 myoglobins. And so if you break a hemoglobin into 4, you have essentially a myoglobin. Myoglobin is in the muscle, and it's going to store and transport oxygen inside the muscle. Hemoglobin is inside your red blood cells, and it's going to transport oxygen from essentially your lungs to the muscles, or to any part of your body that needs it. And so that Moxie measures those two transporters, hemoglobin, myoglobin, inside the capillaries of the muscle. And it's essentially going to say, okay, out of 100, and I like to call them like taxis or cabs. So they're there to transport oxygen. And in a cab, you have typically 4 spots. Hemoglobin can transport 4 oxygens. Myoglobin can transport 1. And out of 100 cabs, how many are full and how many are empty? Because you can't just have one oxygen molecule inside a hemoglobin. It's either going to be 4 or it's going to be 0. And it just measures the 100 cabs, and it says out of 100, how many are full, how many are empty. And it gives you that information twice a second. And so you can see essentially on a continuous basis the saturation level, the oxygen saturation of your muscle. And the number is somewhere between 0 and 100. It's like a 100% scale. And at first, you tend to get fixated on the numbers. And if you have 2 monitors, you'll put one on the left leg, one on the right leg, and you say, oh, I'm at 60 here, but I'm at 50 there. What's going on? The number itself is not very important, at least not at the beginning. What's interesting is to see the trend and how the curve essentially of the saturation is trending. And one thing that I discovered 2 or 3 years after I started using the tool with another colleague called Jem Arnold. I highly recommend all his work. He's doing a lot of research with the Moxie and other NIRS devices. Is that essentially the light, which is an LED light that is used to go and measure those transporters? Well, it penetrates the muscle. I forget if it's 1.5 centimeters or if it's millimeters. It's pretty short distance, right? It doesn't go down to your bone, kind of thing. It's pretty shallow, quote unquote. And what we saw on those different trends, and if we go back to the intensity spectrum that I mentioned before, so the low, medium, high, and very high intensity. Typically, when you do a physiological test, you're going to try and cover the first three levels. So you're going to cover low intensity, medium intensity, and then high intensity. And then there's different protocols that exist, 5-minute intervals, 4-minute intervals, with rest, without rest. But at the end of the day, one of the main goals of physiological testing is going to be to break apart those different levels. What is low intensity for you? What is medium intensity for what is high intensity for you? And then obviously, what can we do with that information and what should you train, right? Because there's what is and then what you should do. And the data doesn't always tell you what to do. It tells you what is, but then you have to use your brain and think and use your coach's eye to determine what we're going to work on. And going back to that Moxie, one thing that was challenging at the start is that there was different trends emerging depending on the person that I tested or even the muscle group that we were measuring. So if we take those three intensity domains, and I'll give you the visuals so it'll make more sense. Sometimes at low intensity, the trend went up, the oxygen saturation went up. Medium intensity, it flatlined. It stayed stable, let's say, and then at high intensity, it started going down again. So it had the kind of hyperbolic trend. So sometimes this is how it presented itself. But other times, it was flat at low intensity, around maybe 50, 60% mark. Then it would go down at medium intensity, and then would flatline way at the bottom, maybe at 20 or 10% saturation at high intensity. And I couldn't, and then one of the main, the early thoughts with Moxie testing was that if you had that kind of parabolic trend, so the kind of up, flat, down, that you had a sufficient supply of oxygen, and so we would call that utilization limited, or more limited by your muscles' ability to extract oxygen, right? Whereas if you had the other trend, so the flat, down, and then flat again, we would say that you're delivery limited, because you can use all the oxygen that you have available, but you can't deliver enough. And so that was kind of one of the main frameworks, thinking about this, doing the testing and saying, oh, okay, so your curve goes up, flat, and down. So we need to work on your muscles' ability to extract more oxygen. We can use sprint training and some other approaches like this. And then on the other side, if we see a flat, down, flat, then we would say that you're delivery limited, and we're going to work on your cardiovascular system and do more traditional endurance training. So that was the main idea. And thanks to Jem, who had some pretty advanced tech a few years back already, we actually saw that you could see both of those trends on the same person at the same time on the same device if you could measure at two different depths. Because oxygen kinetics, delivery, and utilization are different whether you're in a superficial part of the muscle or in a deeper part of muscle.
Wow.
Typically, when you're more on the surface of the muscle, you have more capillaries, and so you have better delivery of oxygen. We'll simplify it and just say this. And then if you go deeper inside the muscle, you have a little bit less delivery, and you typically have a higher density of mitochondria, which is where the oxygen is used. So to make it simple, deep inside the muscle, you use oxygen more easily, and you will deplete faster what you have available. Whereas on the surface of the muscle, or closer to the skin layer, let's say, you're actually going to typically have an abundance of oxygen, and you're not going to be able to use it all, given those parameters that I gave. But essentially, yeah, depending on how far down the light signal of the Moxie goes into the muscle is going to influence what kind of graph you get. Do you get the up, flat, down? Do you get the flat, down, flat? And essentially, you can even see it depending on the adipose tissue layer of somebody. So if somebody's really lean, you'll typically the flat, down, flat. Why? Because we're going deeper inside the muscle. If somebody's got a bit of adipose tissue, then you'll typically see the parabolic trend, because we have to go through that skin layer and adipose tissue first, meaning we're going to be measuring at a more superficial level of the muscle, right?
Wow.
So whereas at the beginning we thought that, all right, if you see that trend, you're limited by this. If you see that trend, you're limited by that. Well, no, it's just that depending on how far down we measure inside the muscle, that's what gives us those two trends. So this is where my understanding started shifting a little bit regarding that limiter system approach, because again, if I have the right device, I can show you both trends at the same time on the same muscle on the exact same person, which means that for me, it no longer is the best explanation as to what is going on and what we can do with that information, right?
Yeah.
And then there was also some ideas around THB, total hemoglobin, which is another metric that you can get from the MOXIE. So the MOXIE has two outputs essentially. It's got the SMO2, muscle saturation, on the 0 to 100% scale, and then THB, which stands for total hemoglobin, and it was supposed to be essentially quantifying how much hemoglobin, myoglobin was present under the sensor. But after talking with Andrew Feldman and Roger Schmitz, who are both the co-founders and co-developers of the MOXIE, they essentially told me that the THB signal was not as reliable as they wanted it to be, and that they wouldn't recommend basing too much interpretation on what was going on with THB. So since that time, I've kind of just focused on SMO2 and haven't looked at THB. I've obviously still recorded it, but I haven't spent as much time looking at the THB as I used to, following the conversation I had with Andrew and with Roger. I'm not saying that we can't find anything useful in it. I think there's some ideas around occlusions that can be relevant with THB. But I felt like the SMO2 trend, coupled with lactate data, coupled with RPE, with ventilation, with VO2, that was sufficient information to kind of push training forward and make decisions around the testing and the training.